Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Theatricom video we're going to be discussing frame rate and resolution, and specifically why frame rate is so important in games, resolution as well, and we're going to be discussing various aspects of this and concerns to the next generation consoles and PC. So you may remember about 2 weeks ago or so I asked people specifically, what do you think the next generation consoles should be in terms of performance? In other words, what resolution and what frame rate? Pretty much unanimously, 60 frames per second for most titles was a requirement, and most people also said that they wanted to see 1080p. So they believe that those should be the targets, especially 60 frames per second. Unsurprisingly, John Carmack and others in the gaming industry have said for a while now that that's actually the plan. You know, that's really what it should be. In reality, it should be a fixed 60 frames per second frame rate, and that's it. Now, it's kind of funny because John, in a recent conference, he was talking at the NVIDIA conference that just happened a couple of days ago, I believe in Montreal, and he said that back in the early days of the PCs, so that would be like when 3DFX, NVIDIA, and ATI, because of course they were not bought by AMD back then, they were all competing. And he said that one of the problems, one of the reasons that frame tearing started to pop up was because he said it was, you know, the GPU manufacturers and the gamers said it was actually John, as well as Epic and all the other like really big game providers. It was actually their fault, because what happened, suffice to say, is that back then variable frame rate was well known. So certain areas of the game looked a lot busier. So suffice to say, what happened is that because of this, the drivers were optimized so that you would get tearing, because you would just get better performance from those areas. And so things have started to happen now where you're getting situations where frame rate is much more consistent in games now. They try not to make it where, for example, one area is 60 frames per second and then another area goes to 30 because of much better graphics, which of course is just a symptom of longer rendering times. In other words, a certain section takes longer to process and to render by the graphics card, and there you have it. And John said back on when they were producing Rage, for example, that it was extremely tempting for them to say, well, you know, 90% of the game is going to be running at 60, just 10% we're just going to go crazy with the effects. But in the end, they decided not to. And they decided that indeed they were going to try to stick to 60 FPS as much as possible. And in fact, they pretty much managed it for the entire game. And I think many would agree that there were problems with this, particularly on the PC. So why is frame rate so important? Now, if you've ever gamed on a console and a PC, one of the big arguments, one of the reasons that I personally love PC gaming is because of the smooth frame rate. Now, some games are annoyingly locked to, for example, 30 FPS on the PC. Fortunately, a lot of titles can be modded to reduce or remove that frame rate. It's extremely irritating. NVIDIA are working on new technology known as G-Sync. Now, G-Sync is going to be exclusive, as far as I'm aware. It's a proprietary software, so it's going to be exclusive to GeForce graphics cards, and that's a piece of hardware that's going to basically fit inside monitors. And how this basically works is that a monitor or a TV refreshes. In other words, it basically redraws the entire image independently of the graphics card. So let's assume, for example, that you have a 60 Hz screen. That means that every second it's going to refresh 60 times, right? Pretty simple stuff. So in other words, that image could be shown again every 60 times for 1 second. Pretty simple. Similarly, if you've got a 120 Hz monitor, you'll see it refresh 120 times every 1 second. Pretty simple. This is completely different, however, to the GPU. Now, a GPU will render frames as fast as possible, as long as you've not got VSync on, or you've not got an artificial frame limiter, or, for example, the CPU isn't the bottleneck. But let's just work in a world where the CPU is not bottlenecking, in which case you've either got the GPU, which is limiting it, or the VSync, vertical sync, is basically going to say, you know what, it's going to try to render things as good as the frame rate, but there's problems with that because sometimes you can get some frame juddering, particularly when things start to get a bit busy, and it can also lower the frame rates. And of course, not having VSync means that it's going to start producing frames faster than your screen can handle. Now, some people are very susceptible to this, and other people it doesn't bother so much. So there's a lot of different components. Now, as I said, the PS4 and the Xbox One, a lot of the titles are going between 60 and 30. For example, Killzone is going to be running single player at 30 FPS. Multiplayer, it's going to be running at 60. The reason behind this, apparently, from what I'm kind of understanding from the developers, is actually the AI on Killzone. It's got a high cost to it, and by high cost I mean that it's extremely expensive in terms of CPU time, and so that they basically couldn't run it at 60 frames a second, which is fine and fair enough. It's first generation, and so on and so on. Now, frame rate directly has a correlation to latency. You can actually do this math pretty simply yourself. All you have to do is take 1,000 by the way is milliseconds, and then you divide it by the frame rate. So for example, if you were to divide 1,000 by 60, you get a number of 16.67. Roughly. I mean, there's tons of decimal places which I'm not going to bother to read out, but there you have it. Similarly, if you were to then divide that by 2, or you could just do 1,000 divided by by 120, you're going to be getting about 8.3. Similarly, if you're doing 30 frames per second, then of course that number would go up, and you get the idea, to about 33. And obviously this is latency, where you're basically waiting for another frame of animation to start appearing. You've also got other issues, of course, in terms of latency. You've got issues such as controllers. Some people actually refuse point blank as much as possible to use wireless. In fact, a lot of fighting game fans will actually use wired, because of, well, one of the reasons for wired joysticks, for example, is because of tournaments, so you don't get signal interference, but the other one is to try to eliminate as much of input latency as possible. You've also, of course, got network latency if you're playing online, and you've also got things such as display lag. Display lag, of course, is very much a problem with the monitor and nothing to do with the hardware of the console. In terms of resolution, well, resolution is kind of a tricky thing. Although the difference between, say, 900p and 1080 or 10, it doesn't actually sound much. I mean, it doesn't, does it? If you say, 1080p versus 900p, it's like, what's 180 between friends? It doesn't sound that tangible. It sounds very minuscule. But in reality, in terms of pixels, it's actually pretty damn high. You're looking at just over 2,073,000 pixels. So I'm going to read out the number 2073600 versus 1.44 million. So that's a hell of a lot of difference between actual pixels. And of course, this means a heck of a lot less work. When we're talking like 1.4 or so times the work, it starts to get pretty profound. And of course, that's only increased even further when we're starting to talk of resolutions of 720p and so on. And obviously, the reason for doing this is to simply, in terms of lowering the internal rendered resolution, is to simply reduce the workload on primarily the GPU, because This is like going to be a situation where when you're lowering the resolution internally that is being rendered at, and this is completely different, by the way, to, of course, the output resolution. You can actually have something that's like 720 by 480, so in other words, like a 480p image, and you could upscale that internally to like 1080, but it's not going to be anywhere near the same quality as 1080. But of course, it also takes a lot less work for the GPU, the video card, basically, to actually render that. And of course, you can actually start to do maths based on the frame rate, and using that frame rate to then start figuring out the latency of how long it actually takes your GPU to render a set frame, depending, of course, on multiple factors, including things such as whether you've got VSync. NVIDIA obviously want to start pushing G-Sync. Obviously, it's their proprietary technology. Their theory behind it is pretty simple. Their theory behind it is that if they can start doing so, it will eliminate screen tearing and will improve performance. And of course, it will also mean that the monitor itself, the display, will only refresh when there's a new fresh frame for it. Obviously, there has to be a minimal and a maximal threshold for this. The minimum is apparently 30, because otherwise you're going to start getting flickering. So let's say, for example, your GPU simply can't process frames fast enough. Let's say, you've got a huge screen, and let's say the game starts dipping to 25 frames a second, in which case the monitor is still going to refresh to 30, so you're going to get some problems there. The other thing, of course, is that the screen can't refresh faster than the maximum ability of the hardware. So in case of a 120Hz screen, you can only refresh 120Hz, and obviously if you've got some really high-end performance stuff in your PC, then you can start seeing how that's going to be a problem. So now we've got a lot of groundwork out the way of how the input latency works and why that's so important. Obviously, not all games require ridiculously high frame rates. Some games are more than okay at 30 frames per second. Games which don't require such smooth gameplay, for example, Japanese style RPGs are one of the easy ones to for example. I don't particularly think that they require it, but when you start getting action games, then you start getting questions of maybe variable frame rate. God of War Ascension, I believe it was, used variable frame rate so that in really heavily populated areas, when there's a lot of visual fidelity, when there's a lot of graphical effects and particles and whatever, the frame rate can start to reduce to whatever, say 30 frames a second or maybe 25 frames a second, depending. And when there's a lot of enemies on screen, the detail levels in the backgrounds will start to drop and diminish, and the purpose behind that is to basically produce a smoother gameplay experience. So, for example, just from one area to another, you may get a situation where the frame rate literally doubles. So you might go from, say, 25 frames a second all the way up to like 45 or 50. And that might sound not exactly ideal, but at the same time, it does promote smoother gameplay, and that's just one of the examples of how you've got these issues. Now, people are going to start pointing out that, it's a next generation. I've seen a lot of posts on various forums and various, people commenting and so on, and criticizing the hardware. The problem is, the PS4 and the Xbox One, there's a lot of marketing hype behind them, and when you start believing a lot of that hype, it's pretty bad for your expectations of what's actually really going to happen. Now, obviously, this is still very early hardware. So in 3 years' time, we're definitely going to get better looking games, but not noticeable, maybe not better frame rates, because it's a hell of a lot harder to show frame rate on the back of a box than what it is a pretty visual. The same thing could be also said, might I add, to other pet peeves of mine, like crappy AI and crappy clipping. Gosh, I hate bad clipping. Things such as lights showing through walls, all the way to blades of grass, coming through the bottom of vehicles, or a gun turret showing through a wall, or a door not opening properly because something's glitching through it. And of course, there are multiple other things which are affected games when you're talking about clipping and crappy AI with bad routines where you're just like, as the guy said, as the team said, Guerrilla, when they were talking about Killzone, back then on the earlier versions of the PS3, you could only have a couple of different enemy types because of the amount of AI subroutines was fairly basic. And obviously, you can't have, for example, 4 enemy types. Let's say one with a riot shield, one with a rocket launcher, one with a sniper rifle, and one with a minigun, and they all basically pretty much do exactly the same thing. Because that would just be horrible. I mean, could you imagine fighting AI like that? They literally all do exactly the same thing, but one just fires one thing and one just fires the other. They're literally dead meat. I mean, could you imagine someone charging with a sniper rifle precisely how someone with a riot shield would charge? It would be crap. And therefore, the importance of different AI subroutines is invariable, but it also increases the amount of work. And obviously, Sony, for example, are planning to farm a lot of this stuff onto compute. The problem is, of course, there is only a finite amount of resources available for the GPU. People are pointing out that, of course, it has much better a much better queue length for compute. It's got 64 available, which is great, and I'm not discounting that, but still, you can only process a certain finite amount of stuff at a time. I think people need to kind of understand that. I mean, for goodness sake, just for example, in the same NVIDIA conference that was going on just recently, Tim Sweeney was speaking to one of the NVIDIA guys on stage, and they were talking a little bit about PC gaming, and the guys were like, what kind of performance are you kind of reaching at the moment with PC? And that's what Tim Sweeney said. He's, of course, one of the head guys at Epic. And NVIDIA said, well, it depends, but, 10 T-flops, 15 T-flops, 20 T-flops. I mean, I just want you to think about that just for a moment. We're talking 20 T-flops of computing power. Now, obviously, that's a hell of a lot more expensive than a PlayStation 4. You're looking at, SLI Titans or SLI GTX 690s or GTX 790s or something like that. In other words, pretty damn expensive equipment. But the bottom line is, it's still, available. And even lower-end GPUs, we're talking, ones that aren't out of the price range of most people, where, not many people are going to be happy to drop. I know what the prices of Titans are in the States now, but I'm guessing between $900 and $1,000. Not many people are going to want to pay, 2 or 3 times that, because obviously of SLI, dual or quad, dual, tri or quad SLI, not many people are going to want to cough that up. There are people who are certainly willing to shell out like $200 or $300 for a GPU, and those things have like, 2 T-flops computing power, 3.5, maybe 4, depending. Obviously, there's a new set of GPUs coming out from AMD. Some of them have already been released. The GTX 780 Ti from NVIDIA is also going to be winging its way out soon as well. And to be honest with you, the only reason that consoles are so are able to compete with devices which are so ridiculously, ludicrously powerful is because of issues with how the PC currently deals with, for example, draw calls, which are basically the CPU issuing a command to the GPU to draw an object and how to draw that object. It's not a particularly big deal if you've got multiple items of exactly the same type. So, for example, let's say you've got a tree, and that tree is copied and pasted in a forest, 1,000 times over. That's fine. That's not too much of a big deal. On the other hand, if you've got like 1,000 different trees and you have to render that, that's when things become tricky. And heavy obscured APIs are becoming issues with that. Obviously, you've got things such as Mantle and OpenGL, which are seeking to improve it. Linux as well is looking to make roads. Microsoft to try and improve it with versions of DirectX. So hopefully that doesn't stuff PCs for too long. Because quite literally in some cases you're getting huge wasted GPU cycles. Why? Because, if it can't process anything because you're just waiting for the CPU, then you're going to get massive dips in GPU usage. There were tests done, for example, that were showing that sometimes the cores of a processor, one whole core, would just be taken up by basically the layer for the API for the video processing, simply because of just how thick that CPU there is. And it's, that's a problem as well. For consoles, it's less of a thing of that, and it's just a thing of that we expect better looking fidelity in our games. We expect things to be highly packed with pixels. Obviously, from the Xbox's perspective, some developers are doing basically variable resolution. So what happens is that dynamic resolution. So, for example, if they feel that the frame rate is starting to become impacted, what they'll do is simply start to draw frames at a lower resolution quality. So, let's say, for example, it could be that it's going at 900p and it notices, if I keep this up, I'm going to be only rendering at 27 frames a second. That's not good. So what we're going to do is we're going to lower the resolution a little bit, and it might go to 800p or whatever, just to try to keep the frame rate up. And obviously they've got a pretty good scaler on the Xbox One, so I'm not going to criticize it too much, because obviously we can argue that the Xbox One could have been better technically. There are issues that I still need to go into with the Xbox One. But I wanted to put this video out because it's been a while since I've done it, so I wanted to kind of give some of my thoughts and findings on this. But honestly speaking, the Xbox One could have been double the performance, it could have been quadruple the performance, and in the end, of course, you're still going to run into the same problems because it's fixed hardware. Obviously, the Xbox One and PS4 also have fairly heavy OSs of their own, not necessarily in terms of API layers, so similar to the PC, but I'm actually referring to something that's a little bit more easier to understand, and that is something like a lot of processes going on, so a certain system reserve. The Xbox One has, of course, 10% of its GPU reserved, which means it has about 1.24, 1.22, something like that, teraflops of computing power available on the GPU, and 2 CPU cores reserved as well as a portion of memory. That's not exactly been confirmed as far as I'm aware how much memory is reserved. I think it's about maybe 3 gigs. Pretty similar on the PS4. You've got no GPU reserve as far as I'm aware, 2 CPUs reserved, and the amount of memory is arguable. People are arguing about that all day long. Some people are saying it's 1.5, 2 gigs, something like that, but it's also you've got dynamic memory on that as well, so that can be dynamically allocated. So yeah, but it's a very complicated topic, and in a perfect world, 60 frames per second at 1080p, of course, would be this, the way to go. But in reality, this isn't necessarily what you can achieve based on fixed hardware, especially when you've got a certain production cost. In other words, you can't spend $500 or $600 on the components, because you've then got to make a markup on that as well. So yeah, there you go. That's why I was saying that you could build a pretty kick-ass Battlefield 4 rig, for example, for about $650, which is pretty good. I think it's about £500. I honestly can't remember what my own video pricing was now, but obviously there you have it. That's what happens when you produce a lot of stuff. Anyway, It's been kind of an itsy bitsy video, this, but I wanted to put this out there because I wanted to answer a couple of questions regarding exactly why frame rate is important that I've been asked, and why frame rate is important in games compared to, say, a movie. And I also wanted to point out this latency thing and a few other bits and bobs, and I wanted to give you guys something to kind of chew on. Anyway, I'm gonna get going, so I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.